some work happening outside my office. They're busy dismantling a roof and putting up a new one. I hope the background noise is not too disruptive. You guys will be able to hear me, actively listen in this active listening webinar. Just checking that I'm coming through okay. Okay, we're up to about 11 people. I'll give you guys just a few more minutes. Yeah, let's check in. It's been a while since we've done one of these. Been a while at least since I've been with you guys. How's everybody today? How's the weather in the different parts of the country that you're in? Or world, perhaps. You might be in different places. I'm keeping an eye on the chat as we go through this, so feel free to pop any messages in there. Okay, Faith, it's chilies and Brakpan. That's interesting. Upcountry, and that is colder. You're not quite getting the benefits of spring, it seems. It's quite a warm day here in Durban, actually. Cold weekend, if I remember correctly, but it's definitely warming up. Hope you're surviving the cold. Okay, so just a quick bit of housekeeping before we get going. My name is James Sturdee. I'm a registered psychological counselor. I'm in private practice in Morningside, Durban. I also consult with Regional Business School, part of the counseling services there. This is part of the webinar series where I at least will be sharing some 21st century skills, life skills, and different competencies that ideally you can use in your professional lives and your personal lives. We've spoken about a number of things this year. We've covered a number of different topics, and it's been a couple of months since I've been with you guys. We're going to pick it up again now. We will be doing, we'll continuing these webinars until the end of the year, 1 month. And today we are going to be exploring this topic of active listening. So what does it really mean to be an active listener? This is something that's quite relevant in certain professions. It's very relevant in a profession such as mine, where a big part of the role that I play is just providing a space for people to speak. And for them to speak, it means I have to be listening, not just listening. I have to be actively listening. And so that might sound a little bit easier than it is. The truth is that it is actually a skill in itself, and not something that everybody is necessarily able to do. And I hope what we will get from this webinar is just an opportunity for you to understand a little bit more what this concept of active listening really is, and how to implement it in your life as a way of improving your relationships, improving your connection with people, and just having another tool in your toolbox that you can use for your social interactions, be they professional, be they personal, or whatever the case might be in that regard. So I'm going to speak a bit generally about communication and what we mean when we're speaking about communication. I'm sure a lot of these concepts you guys will be kind of familiar with, maybe explicitly or implicitly you would have come across some of them. But ultimately, we're going to start by speaking about communication and then zoom in a little bit on actually the listening part of it. But it won't be exclusively just listening. There'll be different aspects of communication that we're going to discuss as we go through the webinar, which is going to be roughly an hour. It might be a few minutes shorter to leave a bit of time for Q&A. Go. But as usual, those of you who are familiar with my style, I do try to keep an eye on the comments, and as we go through this, if anything's coming up that you feel is important, feel free to chip in. It's not a distraction to me at all. If I'm able to, I'll respond to it. If not, I'll come back to it. And if you have any questions as well, feel free to put them in at any time. But as I said, there will also be time towards the end, some Q&A. Okay, so let's get going. Thank you again for joining us. Active listening. So if we're speaking about listening, of course, that is one aspect of communication. And if we're speaking about effective communication, we're speaking about a number of very specific things, because, of course, there is such a thing as ineffective communication, where we're not able to achieve the goals of being heard and being both being heard and being listened to, and also being able to hear what people are saying to us. So effective communication allows us to facilitate understanding in our relationships So this is ultimately the best tool we have for making ourselves understood, but also for understanding other people. It's this tool of communication. That's really, when I think about communication, I think about that as the number one priority. It's not the only thing it can do. A number of other uses, as we'll get to, but ultimately at the top of it for me, it's facilitating understanding. If we're able to communicate well, we're able to understand other people. We're able to give them the opportunity of understanding us. And the reason I say give them the opportunity is we, of course, cannot make another person think a certain way, such as understanding exactly what we're going through. But through good communication, we give them the opportunity to kind of reach that point of understanding. And vice versa, with ineffective communication, there's often misunderstanding, feeling of, no one really knows how I feel about this. No one knows why I did that. No one knows what I meant when he said that, and vice versa. Why did that person say that? What are they doing? That culture of misunderstanding is rarely facilitated in an environment of ineffective communication. So effective communication is about understanding. It also allows us to resolve differences. It's a conflict management tool, of course. So much conflict is caused through communication or miscommunication, but also communication offers us the ability to resolve the differences that we have, to find some type of common ground and reconciliation there. Good communication, effective communication, just as in the case of good conflict and hopeful constructive conflict, builds trust in relationships, because through understanding, we can start to understand people's intentions. We can start to act in way, communicate the good faith that we're coming from, and understand good faith in return when people are acting in good faith. It builds respect as well. The skill of communication is to be able to be direct and honest, but at the same time not damage the relationship that we are operating in. And through that skill, we're able to build the trust. And inside these environments, we foster creativity, problem solving, affection, caring, connection. All of these things are then able to flourish in a context where there is effective communication. As we go through this webinar, I'll speak a bit more about what that actually is. But those are the benefits of effective communication, and things that we would strive for in healthy, productive relationships. So in order to communicate effectively, it comes down to two things, which are quite basic, but they're easier said than done, as it were. So it's about sending messages, and it's about hearing the message. Sending a message to someone else, but it's also hearing the message that's coming back. That might sound simple, but actually there's quite a lot going on along the way that can interrupt those two aspects. So if you think about the process of communicating to another person, let's say just one other person, maybe we can use this example right now. So I'm thinking about the content that I've created here, and I'm thinking about my experiences that I've had. I'm thinking about my understanding of what good communication is. So I have these thoughts in my head. No one else has access to them. We haven't introduced technology that actually allows you to look into my head. I have these thoughts there, and I have this experience, and I have this idea of what it is that I want to say. Through some very automatic, can seem like an instantaneous process, those thoughts are then being translated into the language that I'm using and the words that you are hearing right now, the actual audio that you're hearing in your ears right now. That's the first step of it. So the thoughts I have, and then I'm kind of encoding that into specific words. And this can happen a lot, especially in situations where there's emotional flooding, or where it's a tense situation, or there's fear, or any type of heightened emotional state. You would have experienced this before, I'm sure of. The thoughts that we're having don't necessarily correspond to the words that we're using. So we have this thought, we kind of have this thing that we're thinking, we try to use the words, and it becomes so completely different. So that's the first step there, where things start to go a bit haywire. I say the words, and I might notice that it's different. I might say the wrong word. I often I won't notice when I use the wrong word. You'll then hear the actual words that I'm using, and from that point, you will then infer your own meaning. So what does James mean when he said these specific words? And then you kind of filter that through your own perceptions and your own beliefs and your own kind of pre-existing ideas that are there, and your own judgments, your own experiences, and you're kind of hearing my words through that, and you think, I completely disagree with that, or this guy's an idiot, he doesn't know what he's speaking about, who do we think he is? You have all of the internal noise, or wow, that's really interesting, whatever it might be. And then you're taking that information and you're inferring meaning. So it's gone from something inside of my head through the words that I use, through the language you hear, into your head. And that's communication. You can see that's actually quite a complicated process, and so much that can go awry along the way. There's a couple of components that can either facilitate this understanding or facilitate misunderstanding. And you can think about it in three components in terms of how communication is structured. So it's verbal, paraverbal, non-verbal. It's all quite straightforward. Verbal is the actual words we're choosing, the literal language. Paraverbal is the way we say the words. So do I say it with sarcasm, or do I say it with the tone of anger? Do I say it with kindness in my voice? Do I sound frustrated? This is the paraverbal message. It's slightly different from the non-verbal message. Non-verbal message is my body language. So what is my face looking like? What are my hands doing? What am I doing with my body? Big and intimidating, or small and submissive. I'm not making eye contact. These are the non-verbal messages. Communication and information is being sent through all three of these different mediums. And different research, kind of says different things. There was some research a while ago, 20 years ago, that came out saying that about 93% of what's understood comes through our nonverbal and our paraverbal messages. That's always felt hard to me. I don't think I necessarily buy that. But I think the point is there's a lot that's being communicated, not just in what we say, but how we say it. So looking for those cues in other people is we do that automatically. We're evolved to instinctively take not just the words, but the actual meaning, the information that's being conveyed, because we're kind of social. Of course, we're social, evolved primates, and we're on the lookout for people's emotional cues. How is this person feeling, without necessarily just listening to the words, and also knowing, how are we communicating? What are we putting out? Is a helpful way of checking how we're communicating well as well. Sometimes things like confidence, right? We can kind of communicate in a very unconfident way. We might know what we're speaking about, but if we feel any type of shyness or uncertainty, that often gets communicated, and that can undermine our message as well. So the non-verbals, the paraverbals are a very important part of it. When it comes to the verbals, as much as possible, people use, people have different styles in this regard. Some people will say something in 1,000 words when it perhaps could be said in 10. And I get this in my relationship counseling context a lot, is that the person will make a point, and you'll think, well, okay, that point is heard, let's give the partner a chance to respond. But then the same person will go and kind of make the same point exactly the same point, but in a very different way. And then you'll think, okay, sure, point is made, but then they'll go and again, they'll try to make the point from a different angle. They're using there's so many words there to communicate what can often be quite a simple idea, and that really gets in the way of being heard, because people just start going off, they start to switch off and disengage from it. So as much as possible, just to be to the point, brief and organized. And this is the process of changing thoughts into words, as well as it's an organizing process. So just through the process of speaking, we're taking our thoughts, we're organizing them, and we're trying to make them make sense. And that's something that we can be practiced at and really adept at, or something we can be unpracticed at, not very good at. These are skills that can be developed. The more we're able to be brief and to the point, organized with the content, the information we're delivering, the easier it is for someone to hear it and think, okay, I kind of get the message that I think you're trying to be sent. So free of jargon. Jargon is kind of technical language that can mean one thing, perhaps to hear in a certain setting, but might not mean so much to everybody. It can be confusing. And importantly, effective verbalizing is by not creating unnecessary resistance in the listener. So there is always going to be, especially in emotional situations, conflict situations between romantic partners, there's always going to be the potential for resistance that gets created there, between colleagues as well. It's that internal noise that starts to come up when someone is speaking to us. This person now is asking me to step into their office. What's going on here? What should I be aware of? Do they think they can do my job better than I do? Are they here to judge me? And then the resistance can start to build, and that can start to get in the way of that process of decoding the information and actually understanding the meaning. So for someone who's sending that message, you can't take responsibility for the resistance in the listener, and that you have no control over it, but you do have an influence, which means the words that you use, the verbal paraverb, the non-verbal paraverbals, all of those are going to either heighten the defensiveness and likelihood of resistance, or perhaps disarm them a little bit and allow them to be a bit vulnerable. And if we're using words that are really accusatory and attacking and aggressive, and if our body language is very aggressive, that's much more likely to create resistance in the listener. And then the end goal might be that we win, as it were. We're able to intimidate, but that is a very different objective to actually being heard and being understood. And often that's really what we want. So these kind of accusatory dynamics and power plays end up undermining what we want, which is actually to be heard. So in terms of the nonverbals, as I said, things like facial expression, postures, gestures, a bit of extra research here. 55% what is perceived and understood by others is the nonverbals. That sounds to me like a little bit more helpful. I think that the words that you use do matter too much. Just to go to your point, you're asking about jargon and kind of create interest in listening. I mean, I think having a good vocabulary is a very good way of being understood. But jargon is specifically related to kind of very insider knowledge words. So, something that's very kind of limited perhaps to the industry that it's in. It's not necessarily the same as having a nice expansive vocabulary that can enhance the likelihood of us being able to have the grammatical and language tools that we need to be understood. So that's the challenge with jargon. To get your question there, which is a good one. Paraverbal messages, not how we say it. It's more, sorry, not what we say, but it's how we say it. It's the tone, the pitch, the pacing of our voices. You can hear right now that I'm speaking quite fast. I'm speaking with a lot of intent. That's saying something to you. It's saying to you, perhaps there's a lot of information that I'm trying to get through. Maybe that makes you feel a bit overwhelmed hearing it. There's a lot coming. That's message and information. Messaging and information you're getting just from the pace of my voice. And this can account for up to 38. So you put that together, 38, 55, and you get that magic number of 93, which I think again is quite high. But the main point being these different ways of sending information, apart from just our words, is a very important part of the way that we communicate and the way we receive information as well. So active listening. What active listening is can be differentiated from passive listening. So active listening is you're actually doing something, even though it might not look like it. There's something happening that is an active process. Passive listening is when we're actually not doing anything. We're just thinking about what we're going to have for dinner, or we're just waiting for the person to stop talking, or we're thinking about what we'd like to say, or we're just kind of half in there. We're not really doing any thinking. We're not really putting any cognitive horsepower and trying to understand what's happening. Active listening requires concentration. It requires us to be attentive, and that takes a lot of energy because there's a lot of work that's going on when I'm just seemingly sitting here and doing nothing and listening to you. If I'm actively listening to you, I'm doing a lot of work cognitively trying to understand what is it that you mean. And you'll probably find right now, if you're kind of putting all your attention on this webinar, you're doing a version of active listening right now. You're not just sitting back, but you're actually trying to engage the words that I'm using because you want to make sense of them and you want to really understand what I'm saying. How often do you use the same amount of attentiveness that you're using right now to listen to this psychoeducational information? How often do you use that in actually listening to the people in your lives, right? And if you're normal, the answer is not very much. Occasionally, you might be able to turn it on. Maybe you never do. Maybe you're rare to use it. But just being able to notice the disparity, the difference there is important. It's about psychological connection. So psychological connection, again, that's from my mind to your mind. They're trying to facilitate that connection there in the way that we can. And there's a couple of different ways we do that. Words one way, the other, kind of the other things that as social primates we use to connect to eye contact that facilitates a psychological connection. So kind of hooking up to your brain, and we're trying to find a way of connecting that way. And it requires an active desire and a willingness to try and see things from another perspective. And that's not something that comes naturally, necessarily. It takes work to say, okay, I'm actually going to try to put the energy into this to understand, how are you seeing the world right now? How are you seeing me right now? How are you understanding things? This is what makes a good teacher as well. A good teacher is someone who's able to, have a lot of information in their head, but they're able to actually understand where the people they're teaching are in terms of their understanding of that information. And that's also very hard to do, because if you're very familiar with content, whatever information might be, let's say you've been working as a philosophy lecturer for 30 years, you know it all very well. And when you're speaking to a first year student about philosophy, it's very hard to imagine their kind of understanding of where they might be. So you might dumb it down too much, or you might not understand the things that they don't understand. So being a good teacher is about getting a good sense for where that person is in the world, where they are in terms of how they're understanding you. And they're tools to be able to, that's not just mind reading, they're tools that we can use to gain that information about what another person's perspective is. We're not left at the mercy of just saying, like, well, I'll never know. We can ask questions, we can explore, we can listen, try and see where is the person coming from, and that facilitates that psychological connection. Active listening requires suspending judgment and evaluation. That means we put it on pause. So, we might hear someone say something and think, well, that's stupid. How could you think that? What a ridiculous thing to think. How could you actually think that I was doing that on purpose to you? Or constantly kind of evaluating and putting a value judgment on what someone's saying. Because then you're already stopping yourself from understanding where they're coming from, but you're also filtering so much of that information through your own exaggerations. So when you are using active listening skills, you are then able to also look at the non-verbals as well as the verbal, in the same way that when you're sending, you're aware. So you can also send out messages non-verbally that I'm listening. Eye contact is one way of saying this. You're talking to me and I'm looking at the sky, or I'm looking at my watch, or I'm just kind of, looking all around the room, or heaven forbid, looking at my phone. That's going to send a very clear message to how engaged and attentive I am to what you're saying. Whereas if I'm able to, have eye contact, look at you, not look too distracted, that's a helpful way of sending a non-verbal message that I'm attentive, and that's going to increase your likelihood to be vulnerable and to open up in that way. And then also, of course, being aware of the non-verbal review sending and what do they mean. And if they don't make sense to me, maybe you said you're angry, but you're smiling. Let me use my words to forward you and say, what's going on there? I'm getting a mixed message. Using communication skills to then enhance our activeness. So pay attention to the words and the feelings that are being expressed, but don't get too focused on the words. So this is a subtle point, but an important one. It's easy, especially in a complex situation, to get too legalistic. So you said this specific thing, you use this specific word, and now I kind of hold you to that. And I said, well, you use that word, so it must mean that you believe this. And then you say, no, I don't believe that. I just use that word, and maybe it means something different. And I say, no, you use that word. This is what it means. And then I'm kind of, cornering you, and that makes a good lawyer. It doesn't necessarily make a good interlocutor to someone that you're speaking to, because you're pigeonholing the person based on the legalistic use of words, as opposed to trying to say, okay, well, the words matter, the feelings matter, the non-verbals matter. How do I get an overall sense of what it is that you're trying to convey? What is the meaning of what you're trying to say without getting too stuck on the words, but at the same time hearing the words? And if I feel like something's not making sense, feel like you've used a word that is revealing, to kind of ask you to explain it as opposed to telling you what you meant, telling you what you believe. We can use reflective listening tools, which I'll unpack here a bit, just in terms of increasing the understanding. These are tools we can use whilst we're active listening to help the speaker tell their story. So these are again tools that are used in counseling quite a lot, psychotherapy. They're quite handy to be able to use other relationships as well. But they are things like paraphrasing. So the point is to take what the person has said and then give it back to them in your own words. And that is a way of kind of reflecting what they are saying. That's helpful for them, because then they can hear their words back and they can say, yes, I meant that. That's exactly right. And then they feel understood, and that's very validating for a person. That will increase their trust in your ability to hear them and to understand them. And it'll probably make them less likely to try railroad you or be forceful to you. But it's also helpful to you, because then you're also making sense of their words. And you're saying, okay, well, I heard that. I'm going to put it back to you in different words. Tell me if I'm right. That's paraphrasing. Very powerful piece of weaponry in the communication landscape. Yeah, there's another point I was going to make about paraphrasing, but it's escaped me. But I think it'll come back as we go through this. it's using different words. That's the key. It's not necessarily using the same words. So reflecting feeling, this is not necessarily about just the words, but it's about the feeling. So I'm hearing that you're angry. You're not saying it, but I'm hearing frustration. I'm hearing that you're resentful at me for this thing I keep. That's important as well. So paraphrasing is about the general gist of what you're saying. The feeling is about saying, okay, yeah, those are the words. What I'm hearing is actually you're feeling quite rejected. Is that true? Or you're feeling like I'm not appreciating you, I'm taking you for granted. Or you feel like I'm bullying you, being able to just speak to the emotional spirit beneath that. And then summarizing, which is similar to paraphrasing, but it's a bit more of a kind of zoomed out 30,000 foot view. It's not just about, okay, well, I'm going to say 10 sentences. It's saying, okay, well, this is all of what I'm hearing. I think that I get the sense you're feeling this way. This is what I'm hearing you say. This is how I think you're feeling about it. Am I right? Is this right? What can we do about it? And then questioning, the kind of Socratic method, which is to ask questions to illuminate understanding, both in ourselves and both speaking to. And again, not to be wary of the kind of legalistic approach that they say a good prosecutor never asks a question they don't know the answer to. Sometimes we do that in our relationships, complex situations. We ask questions knowing the answer. That's infuriating for people. People find that infuriating because most people are not very stupid. And they know what you're doing. They know that you're trying to put them in the corner. What time did you say you would be home, for example? Kind of putting a person in the corner, as opposed to saying, okay, I remember this. You said that you're going to be home at this time. Is this true? Do you remember it that way as well? How would you feel about it if you were me? What were you thinking that made you think that I was okay or that I'd be okay with it? That's kind of open questions, gaining information, gaining clarification. They're not power plays. Barriers to verbal communication are many, but the big ones are things like attacking, criticizing, blaming. The Gottman Institute, which is a famous school of therapy for relationship counseling, they describe four horsemen of toxic conflict and four things that are very likely in the practitioner's experience to lead to relationships that break down, and they're telling us to increase the likelihood of divorce. And these four things, you can see some of them there, but more expansively, the four horsemen are stonewalling, criticism, defensiveness, and contempt. So these are barriers to communication and barriers to really good connection between people: stonewalling, criticism, contempt, and defensiveness. You can see interrogating and blaming kind of overlapping those as well. The you messages, you're this type of person, or you're a terrible partner, you're a terrible father, you're a terrible person, you're so selfish, you only think of yourself, you're a narcissist, you don't love me, or you wouldn't do this, you don't respect me. These are really kind of pigeonholing a person, putting them in a perspective, judging them, shaming them. They're going to create a lot of resistance in the person hearing those types of judgments, as opposed to turning it around and saying, I feel this way when you do this. It makes me feel as though I don't mean anything to you, or it makes me feel as though you don't care about me. That's the difference. And then power, power plays. These are important dynamics to look out for in relationships. What's happening with power here? Do I find myself in this constant struggle where I'm not willing to concede anything? I'm trying to just take the power back from you. It stops me from being vulnerable and stops me from being honest as well. Am I just using the power now as a way of demonstrating my will or getting my will my way? That's a very significant barrier to healthy communication. And then things like shouting. If you're yelling and raising your voice, some people say that I'm just a loud person, I just speak loudly. That might be true, some people do, but just be aware of the impact it's going to have on the person who's listening. And if you shout when you get angry, you're probably going to find people are switching off, or they are going to respond on your level, and then you're going to be yelling at each other. The name calling, all of those toxic patterns there as well, the silent treatment and manipulation comes out of that. Nonverbal communication barriers, those are the verbal ones. The nonverbal ones are things that you are doing that are getting in the way. So rolling your eyes, arms crossed, legs crossed, that's those are not necessarily golden rules as such. So I would sometimes say arms crossed. That's just because it's comfortable for me. Doesn't necessarily mean I'm closed off. But if I'm trying to make an effort to appear open, it would make more sense for me to communicate that with my body language, as opposed so being mindful of my body language is helpful, as opposed to looking very close or very shoulders up. Exasperated gestures, sighs, exhales, appearing disinterested by slouching over or doodling, which is drawing on something, just appearing distracted, staring at a person in a very intimidating way, or avoiding eye contact at all. These get in the way as well, and those can be distracting, and they can also be send a message that, well, you don't seem to be very interested, and then just fidgeting or appearing distracted, not appearing engaged, actively listening. So effective communications is a set of skills, and we're going to go through these for last 20 minutes or so that we have. It's a set of skills that you can put together. There's different ways of approaching this problem of effective communication, but I find it's quite helpful to think about in terms of these 4 different competencies. So attentive listening, the nonverbal communication, the ability to manage stress in those moments of conflict, and the ability to recognize and understand your own emotions and the emotions of others. So that's another way of saying that is your emotional intelligence. So if you can put these things together, you would probably be quite a communicator if you're able to attentively listen, to be mindful of it on nonverbal communication, both yours and your interlocutor. The way your stress either undermines your ability to understand and to be understood, or the way that you're able to manage your stress so you can be understood and can understand, but then also your own understanding of your own emotional experience. And those are the people you're communicating with. So, number 1, listening. This is one of the most important aspects. It's often undervalued. And if you ask people, what's the most important thing in your relationships, most people are going to say, I just want to be heard. I want to be understood. Such a big human need to be understood. But the problem is that most people want that. Most people aren't necessarily creating an environment to facilitate it. In other words, they're not giving it. They're not listening. So there's an asymmetry there between these 2 things. So successful listening is not just about understanding the words, but also about feeling it, as we covered before. If you're able to listen effectively, you feel heard, you feel understood, you build a stronger, deeper connection. Again, an environment where things feel safe. You save time in unnecessary clarifications and misunderstandings, and relationship breakdowns that actually are unnecessary because they're based on misunderstanding. Speaking. Then also reliving negative emotions. So when emotions are running high and you're able to listen to the person who's feeling those emotions, you give them an opportunity at least just to find some type of relief from it. That you can decide how much of that you want to take on. But if you're able to do that and able to weather the storm, as it were, without allowing yourself to be disrespected, you then provide a culture and a relationship where there can be more trust. And with trust comes the ability to be vulnerable. If we can trust, we can be more vulnerable. And if we can be more vulnerable, so these things are all very much trust, connection, vulnerability. How do we get trust? Well, we have to kind of prove it. We have to build trust over time through our words and our deeds. If you're focusing on effective listening, again, it's about focusing fully, really attentively engaging with all of these things that are, all these messages, all this information that's out there. Don't interrupt unnecessarily. So not all interruptions are the same. Sometimes an interruption is helpful. I don't see interruptions necessarily as a bad thing. I think if you're interrupting to get your point across, that's not helpful. But if you're saying, hang on, something you said that didn't make sense, or can you tell me about this, or tell me, just say more about the specific thing you're saying, you're still listening. You're using that interruption as a way of listening. You're saying, yes, I'm still very much carrying you. I'm still very much wanting to hear you. I want to understand. That's why I'm interrupting you. I just want to direct something you said there. I really would be helpful to me if you could speak more on that. Most people are going to respond very well to that because they recognize you still, yes, you're interrupting. They'll have that brief moment of, don't you interrupt me? But they'll realize very quickly that you're kind of still very much in the mindset of wanting to listen, and they will respond. So avoid judgment. Judgment is a killer for trust. It's a killer for vulnerability. To feel that what's being said is having some type of value judgment on it. That gets in the way of that connection, that profound connection that can happen. And then just message non-verbally or verbally you're interested. You are indeed interested. Nod, smile, raise your eyebrows, whatever it is. Just encourage the person to continue talking. These are effective activist techniques. So we covered quite a lot of that already, so I won't spend too long on it. But to move on to the second effective communication skill, this is about nonverbal communication. You can see so much of this. And again, because we're social animals, there are parts of our brain that are just really focused on what another person's face is doing. We get so much. If you look at these faces picture, then you get a lot of the sense, those are the ones you see, you get a sense for what's going on without hearing any words, that what's going on in this person's head. You kind of look at them and you can just see you can just kind of receive that information. So yeah, body language again, so instrumental, so material in these interactions. But knowing that allows us then to use it, to utilize it, to leverage it in our example, in our favor. For example, just being able to understand, okay, well, someone is going to be, paying attention to what I'm doing with my body. How do I then use that as a way of making myself understood more, whether it's public speaking, for example, or in leadership roles. Maybe it's in a relationship where you understand that the person you're speaking to is afraid of you. How do I then kind of facilitate them being open and honest with me? How do I limit the body language that I might exhibit that would lead to them feeling more intimidated? How do I make them feel at peace with the body or feel at ease with my own body language? There are tools you can use for developing these things. One of the interesting ones, a practical example is you practice in real life. So you become a people watcher. Watch how other people are speaking to each other. Whilst, of course, maintaining all sorts of privacy considerations and everything else. But for example, if you're on a bus in a restaurant, across a lecture hall from someone, just pay attention to how they're speaking to each other and try imagine. I wonder what it is that's being said. What is the information that's being conveyed here? And then let's go deeper than that. What is that person's emotional state? Can I try create a narrative of what might be going on in their head? Those are the building blocks for emotional intelligence in terms of social awareness. Knowing, maybe do I have it in me to kind of start piecing it together? Why might they be doing that? Why might they be saying that? Or why might they be coming from? That's the building block. And as I say, that's the beginning of it. It's not the end of it. It's not like we take that narrative and think, okay, well, now we know why that person's doing it. But we start to become better at saying, okay, well, these might be the reasons. That's my starting point. Let me explore it more through communication. Of course, this is not with the people you're observing, but you take those skills into your communication dynamics, and you then say, okay, well, I wonder where this person's coming from. What are they feeling? And then you use the tools that you have to explore that, to see if you're right, to gain a better understanding of where they're coming from. Because if you're able to do that, you're going to get a lot of benefits from being able to understand where another person is coming from, and hopefully, healthy, balanced relationship. You're also going to encourage them to take time for this, understand you. But you can't just allow that to kind of happen magically. You have to then use your words to make it so. So make sure your nonverbals match up with your words. This can be confusing sometimes. Maybe we say something, but we're really good at hiding our feelings, and that doesn't necessarily lead to us being taken seriously. Being able to channel our emotions into words is a skill in its own way, which is to not kind of be completely flood another person with our emotions, but to be able to let them be part of the conversation and part of the process. And then adjusting, being able to not just have a one-size-fits-all approach, being able to be flexible in the way that we use the tone of our voice, the way that we speak when we're upset, just being able to have control over that and say, I'm going to be mindful, I'm going to be intentional about these. And then again, using your body language to convey the positive things, even when you're not actually experiencing it. This is something more for kind of confidence building as well, whether it's the presentation, public speaking, you can present a certain confidence that then translates into you feeling confident. And if you're kind of shaking, that then translates back into you not feeling very confident. That can be a challenge in its own way, but that's something you can practice doing as well. Is use the things that make you feel big and powerful, shoulders back, eye contact, firm handshake. These types of things can then feed back into your own mindset. Okay, so that's 2 of 4. I'm going to go through these last 2 whilst we have a bit of time, and we will have some questions. So if you're having any questions, make a note of them now. Anything that you would like to know more about. Okay, so number 3, managing stress. Stress, of course, is a part of life. Stress is a natural part of being a human being. In small doses, it's very, very helpful. Acute stress can help us perform and makes us take things seriously that we should take seriously. It gets us acting when we're feeling a little bit complacent. Really, really good thing. Life without stress, boring, it's unstimulated. Being able to kind of feel stressed to perform in the moment is something that's incredibly satisfying. But if stress becomes constant, if we're amplifying stress unnecessarily, if we're always under this chronic stress, we're never able to feel at peace, then it becomes very counterproductive very quickly, and it gets in the way of good communication. So because we're social beings, again, communication, social interactions can be stressful experiences, and a lot of mammals feel rejection like physical pain. Mammals feel rejection like physical pain. So think about that. We actually we're so afraid of being rejected that our brains have evolved to make us do everything we can to avoid it. And there's good survival reasons for that socially. That 500,000 years ago, rejection from the tribe quite easily mean death. Now you get rejected from your social circle and it sucks, but you don't die. 500,000 years ago, you get rejected from your social circle and you probably end up dying. So our brains are still operating on levels. So there's a lot of stress with interpersonal relations. And that means that we can become overwhelmed in these moments. This is why we don't like conflict. This is why we don't often say what we think. We try to keep other people happy. So one key aspect of communicating effectively and also listening effectively, not allowing all of the noise to come in and to derail the communication, is being able to manage our stress appropriately. So that feeling, of course, that feeling of being stressed when there's a big argument coming, or there's something to say, or that your partner's upset with you, or that your friends you've upset them. That's a very normal feeling. And if you're able to use a mindset that facilitates the stress, kind of focuses you, and you can perform under that, that can be helpful. But if you're allowing the stress to derail you and to kind of, fear very quickly becomes inhibitive. So when we're afraid, we're not able to move very easily. We're also not able to speak very easily. And we're kind of thinking about everything and overthinking. They use the right word. What should I say? What are the perfect things that fear then starts to pile up judgment. So being able to channel stress, which is essentially it's a presentation of fear, be able to channel that into focus, and to be able to actually still say what we mean as much as we can when we're stressed. That's a skill that gets developed over time. And really, one of the main ways of developing is being in those situations. You can't practice on couches where you've got to kind of lean into the uncomfortable situations and learn from them, become better at them, and learn. I felt this way, but I was still able to show up. I was still able to say what I meant. This is what worked. That's why practice is so important. So in terms of managing stress, just acknowledging it's important to recognize it. You don't judge it. Know that it's a normal part of being human. Understand what it feels like. Be mindful about the experience of being stressed. What does it feel like in my body right now to be stressed? Where do I feel it in my body? That's one way of getting some regulation over it, because you're kind of stepping up and saying, I am not stressed, I'm experiencing stress. Very important distinction there that allows you to notice it, to observe it, to be curious about it, but then also to be able to perform and choose in the way that you like to. The pause is helpful as well, engaging the more rational parts of our brain, pausing, allowing the emotions to subside slightly so we can engage and bring online the rational thinking parts of our brain. And bring your senses to the rescue. These are grounding techniques. You can kind of focus on the things around you. There's Often people use this for dealing with panic attacks. 5 things that I can see, 4 things that I can touch, 3 things that I can hear, 2 things that I can smell, 1 thing that I can taste. That's just focusing you now on the present. It's grounding you in the present. Yeah. It's very helpful in terms of just stopping that very associative process that can happen with feeling overwhelmed, stress. Humor can be helpful, but we have to be careful about that. Know the target audience there, and if you're using humor and someone is very upset, you might find that backfires. I think that you're not taking it seriously. But being able to sometimes use humor as a way of taking some of the seriousness out of the communication, out of the conflict, but at the same time acknowledging that we're hearing what the other person's saying, that can just at least give a bit of perspective there. And compromise as well, of course. So links to conflict generally, but knowing when we need to compromise and when we can't, which is about agreeing to disagree. We don't have to agree on everything. It's just being able to move away from the situation and if necessary, return to, depending what it is. Finally, emotional awareness. This is kind of the theme that runs through all of this, is your emotional intelligence. Emotions are such an instrumental part of the way that we communicate and the things that we're trying to communicate and what the people in our lives are trying to communicate to us. To have some type of emotional intelligence around that is vital, and without it, you will find your communication is not going to be very effective at all. So yeah, obviously we're kind of swamped and flooded with information. So effective communication is not just about swamping another person with everything that's in our head, but being able to target effectively the meaning of what we're trying to say and also the feeling of what we're trying to say. These things kind of overlap to give the overall message, the meaning and the feeling. Emotional awareness is about tools for understanding the words that we use, the way that we use it, the way that we understand and have insight into our own feelings. So, I know we did an emotional intelligence webinar previously, so I won't spend too long on it, but just to be able to have that insight into what am I feeling, why am I feeling it, and that's the building blocks for then being able to communicate that to another person. Because if I'm ignorant of my own emotional experience, if it's invisible to me why I'm actually feeling this way, I'm going to find it impossible to communicate to you what's going on inside. So connection to another person starts with connection to ourselves. And also, again, to come back to active listening, we're listening to another person, being aware of the feelings that are bringing up, and this is so important as well, because we can get, they can become detours. And if someone says something, you feel the strong feeling and you run with it, as opposed to being able to pause mindfully and say, okay, I felt this, what's going on with that? Can I bench it? Can I come back to it? Should I be listening? That's two aspects of emotion awareness. So yeah, emotional awareness is your moment-to-moment emotional experience. What's happening right now in the moment? Am I curious? Am I mindfully curious about that? How can I live it? With emotional awareness, we're able to empathize. That allows us to actually have this perspective of, why is this person saying this? They normally acted in this way, now they're acting in a very uncharacteristic way. What's going on here? We understand it. Of course, understanding what's going on with ourselves as well, and how these things then interlock, right? The way that another person acts, we feel, the way we act. And then emotional awareness also helps us to stay connected, stay motivated, and to focus on empathy. As I mentioned earlier, active listening is about that willing desire to understand, to be motivated to understand who we're dealing with, why they're and then, yeah, not everything we say people are going to like it. Not everything other people say we're going to like, and it's an important part of human relationships. Delivering the truth, our truth, even if it means perhaps disappointing someone or upsetting someone or causing them to feel angry with it. We can still communicate clearly and effectively. In fact, it's arguably more important when we're delivering difficult messages, difficult content, that we do communicate clearly, effectively. And then again, this helps us to build strong, trusting, rewarding relationships that are really based on your respect, transparency, vulnerability, and deep connection as a result. Okay, I want to leave some time for questions. So again, yeah, not to spend too long on this. Thinking and feeling is such an important part of it. Let us open it up right now, or some Q&A, just because I'm mindful that we just have a couple of minutes left. That is the ins and outs of active listening and embedded in communication as a whole. Any thoughts or feelings about that? Any questions? So Nelly, I see a hand. Go ahead. Do you want to go on, Mike?
Can you hear me?
Yes, Nelly, you're coming through. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I had installed my app just for the meeting. Now I hadn't taken care of the settings. All right, thanks for the session. Just a question. I'm not sure they'll be relevant or not. In terms of active listening during the for example, if one is solving a conflict at the workplace, is it really necessary to listen to the issues? Probably, let's make an example: two employees having conflict, to listen to them sharing their stories, or am I at risk of having my emotions involved in the conflict, thus compromising the ability of taking or resolving the conflict? I just want a bit of a guidance there, because one would thought that maybe not getting involved in the conflict will enable one to come to a decision that is not biased and that is independent. That's my question. Thanks, James.
Personally, I dropped out there. I had a connection issue. I see you being muted. Was assistant. Do you mind unmuting? Carry on.
Okay. I'm not sure where did you lose me?
Sorry. Yeah, you were just asking about two employees, and what is the value of actually listening to them? And I lost you at that point when you were giving the example.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Let me run that by you again. I'm outside. I'm not sure whether the wind is disturbing me. All right. I was asking in respect of listening to the conflict about two employees. Whether is it really beneficial to listen to their stories? Is that not going to compromise my ability of taking an independent decisions in an attempt to resolve the conflict? Because one would say, rather refer the employees to the policy than getting your emotions involved into the issues that are bringing does may be, compromise your ability of taking an independent decision in terms of resolving the conflict. I just want to know whether is it advisable to listen to them? Is that not going to, get my emotions involved? Like, for example, if an employee is an issue that is a nuisance to me, and I also, take that side, whereas maybe I'm taking the wrong approach in terms of resolving the conflict. That's my question, James. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, great, Nelly. Thank you. It's a great question. It's a really great question. I think it's, the answer, the cop-out answer is it depends, of course. It depends on the situation, what the conflict's about. But I hear the point you're making, which is, what if I become too emotionally invested? Is that going to cloud my judgment? I think yes, there's a potential for that, but it's important to understand as well that empathy is not action, right? So I can empathize with another person. I'm responsible for my own feelings. I'm responsible for what I choose to do with that. And trying to, remaining objective is really, really important, of course. But if I'm not able to actually understand why a person is doing a certain thing, that's probably going to cloud my ability to mediate if that is my role. So, it depends on what your role is, what are the expectations of you in those situations, how involved should you get, should you allow them to deal with it? But if you're quite involved in it and you really want to understand what's going on, why this is happening, I would say that a kind of active, an active attempt to empathically understand what's going on is very, very important. But again, you get to choose what to do with that information. You get to choose how invested to become. You get to choose how much responsibility to take or not to take for what they're dealing with. It is a conflict, which I understand. And yeah, great question. Okay, I see there's another one from Anonymous. I'm going to just open up on it. Doris, I saw you had a hand up. Try to find you again. And yeah, Doris, if you would like to speak, you're welcome to.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're coming through.
Okay, thank you. My question is in relation to email etiquette. You know how we communicate most of the time via email at work. So the question I have is in relation to when you review things for your colleagues, maybe correspondences for your colleagues, and you highlight certain things that needs attention in red. Is that an acceptable color to use when you review on email, not with the tracking changes, but in the body of the email?
Yeah. What is your sense on that one, Doris? What do you think?
I've been using red my whole life, and to my shock, I just been alerted that red is actually not a good color to use on the body of the email, even if the intention is to highlight, you know, it's pointing a person to be able to spot the query quicker and be able to fix. Yeah, because the other colors, they're not so visible. So I prefer red. You cannot miss it.
Yeah. Yeah, I get that. Interesting question. Yeah, it's something I've not really thought about. It's a bit outside of my area of expertise. I will speak with caution. Don't take what I say as gospel. But I think it's not something I would have necessarily noticed as being problematic. And I think the point there perhaps is to be able to hear how other people are thinking, right? Because yeah, you and I might look at that and think, well, it's just a practical way of highlighting some attention, right? It's actually quite helpful. I think I would see it that way as well. But what you are learning is that other people might see it as, you know, aggressive, perhaps, or, you know, unnecessarily critical, you know, whatever it might be, how that interpreted it. And just being able to hear that, even if you don't necessarily agree with it, or share that belief, helpful and saying, okay, well, you know, what do you do next then? You know, if they're kind of flagging it as something, going back to them and saying, well, how would you like to do it? And you can kind of see if that makes sense, if you're willing to yes to. Yeah, I mean, it's not, I'm with you, it's not something I would have necessarily seen as problematic, but I can see the value in being able to have a conversation around it. Thank you for that question. That's an interesting one, Doris. No, we're out of time, so I'm just going to take this last question from Anonymous. If you're a manager and have an employee who has a problem with emotional intelligence, are there activities one can apply to conversations to increase their ability to actively listen to instruction? So again, we're just going with there's two aspects. So there's the things you can do in order to limit unnecessary resistance in them. That comes down to your nonverbals, comes down to if you kind of staying away from power plays, aggressive communication, being able to use your words mindfully, non-judgmentally. That's what you can do. But ultimately, their emotional intelligence, their development in that regard, they're going to have to work on that. You could flag it, you can kind of encourage them to get coaching on it, or you can say that's an area for development. Being able to separate the two is really important. You can't take responsibility for kind of upskilling their emotional intelligence. That's a personal objective. But yeah, you can be mindful of the words that you use. You can be mindful of how they might be acting. You can be mindful of what might be motivating their responses that might seem unacceptable to you. And introducing those emotional intelligence dynamics into the relationship, you kind of invite them to come along. You encourage them to say, well, this is the level at which we're having this conversation. I'm inviting you to join me on this level, whether they do or not. That is going to be up to them, and then you get to respond.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I'm good, and you?
Guys, we're at time. So I'm going to thank everybody for your participation and for joining, and we'll pick it up again in a month's time. We will be talking about the next topic. I'm just laughing at Sonetta's comment about the color being the color and was concentrated on the content. Yeah, there's actually some truth to that. Thank you, everybody. Good to catch up. Again towards the end of October. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.